Welcome to the IT Fundamentals Training Series. I am your host, Mark Halpton. Today is episode 44 regarding managing folder and file structures. Let's go create some Lego bricks. Welcome to the IT Fundamentals Training Series. My name is Mark Halpton. And today we're going to talk about managing folders and file structures. But before we do that, someone pointed out to me, I've recorded a whole bunch of podcasts from my office here in Denver, Colorado. It's an office park in the south side of the city, so it's in the city area, but there's a family of hawks that are apparently living in the trees right outside of my office window here. And they've been squawking or squeaking or whatever. And some people have noticed that that's coming through perhaps on some of the audio at a very faint background. And somebody wondered, are you out in the middle of a forest recording or something? And no, I'm not. I'm in the middle of an office park in the south side of Denver, and there's some hungry hawks that are running around outside. I've seen at least 3 different ones. But anyway, today we're going to talk about managing folders and file structures. And I just wanted to introduce that little hawk story to apologize if you're hearing some squeaking in the background. I do try and keep that noise down as much as I can for you. But here we go. So managing files and folders. So first of all, let's understand the difference between files and folders. Folders are containers that contain files. Folders usually contain multiple files and are utilized for organizing groups of files together. So files are actual documents, PowerPoint documents, Word documents, things along those lines that you want to restore or want to store as a grouping together typically. Another word for folders is a directory. Okay, so those are 2 terms you need to know for the test. Is when they talk about folders or directories, they're talking about one and the same thing. So when data is stored on the computer, as we've talked about many times before, on the hard drive, is stored as zeros and ones. And what happens, these directories help the computer understand where to go and find the files, as well as there's some tagging that occurs on the hard drive there as well. So one of the things the book talks about is partitioning the hard drive. We've already talked about that. If you skipped episode 43, this is 44, so episode 43, in the previous episode, we talked about those types of things with partitioning. Actually, it was 2 episodes ago, it's 42, where we talked about partitioning and different aspects like that. So if you are not familiar with that, go back and look at that. So once that partitioning is completed and the hard drive has been formatted, again, we talked about that in episode 42, then you can start to store the data on there. And what you do is you store these in a file structure or a file system that you choose. All right. So during that episode 42, I talked a little bit about, I mentioned formatting it as a file allocation table or FAT32 or NTFS. And if you look at table 4.7, these are the common file systems that are utilized out there. So Windows has 3 of those. It's FAT, FAT32, and NTFS. Now, you will not find FAT anywhere anymore. File allocation table. You'll not find that anymore. That's obsolete. That was part of Windows 3.1.1, Windows 95, and Windows 98, if memory serves. FAT32 was what replaced that, which is a 32-bit version of FAT. And it still exists, but I recommend never formatting your drive that way. It's a very basic formatting type of function. And there is no security and no journaling, which we'll get to in just a moment. We'll talk about what journaling means, but there's no security on that. It's just files thrown on a drive. Nothing can block them, or nothing can block the bad people from getting in. There's no encryption. There's nothing like that that's possible. But under NTFS, which is the current default for Windows, you can apply a whole bunch of functions such as security, journaling, looking at file access errors and things along those lines that will help you manage the files and secure the files properly. All right. So just briefly, Mac OS uses something called a hierarchical file system, or HFS. Linux, there's 3 different versions of those, and they're EXT or extension, or 3rd extended file system, which is EXT, 4th extended file system, which is EXT4, and the current version is the high performance version, which is XFS or extended file system. So um, we're gonna focus on what Windows is doing because that's what the book focuses on. That's what 90 some odd percent of the world utilizes, and even within that, we're going to focus on NTFS. So let's take a look at these kinds of what can happen on these NTFS systems. So first of all, NTFS will allow you to manage the disk space and the file access. So we talked about that in episode 42, where we're managing the disk space by doing partitioning. And the file access we really haven't talked about, but that's just using directories or folders and being able to organize things. Okay, so when an application or even Windows itself is installed on the computer, it will install in an organized directory system. But even when you go into like a temp folder or a temp directory, you could create your own folders and that you could put your files in. So, for example, I have a 16 terabyte hard drive where I store all of my almost 100,000 digital photographs. And inside of that, I have a file table, a file system. You know, one is for my aviation files. The next one is for my, I call it places I've been. And I've got one for all my animals, and I've got one for landscapes, and so on and so forth down the way. And then underneath that, underneath the aviation folder, for example, or the places folder, I've got additional folders. So under places, I've been to Alaska, so I've got a folder just for Alaska, and I've got one for Montana, and I've got one for Wyoming, and I've got one for Maryland, different places I've traveled. So I can very easily, you can see this in your mind, you know, kind of perceive this in your mind that if you're on my hard drive, you're going to be able to get to pictures that are about Montana or were taken in Montana just by simply following, places. And then, yeah, there's the Montana folder. And then underneath that, there's even cities and national parks where I've taken some of the folders in there before you actually get to the folder. If you're in my animals folder, I've got them broken down. There's the black bear, and there's the grizzly bear, and there's the bighorn sheep, and there's the elk, and so on and so forth. So if you want to see if you want to see a picture of an elk, then you can go to that folder. Now, you can so that's one way to do the directory, but you can also then you'll put all your files in there, but you can also name your files in a way that will allow you to find them easily as well. So you can make, like my elk, for example, you can name them elk dot Yellowstone dot, and then maybe the date 2022.10.15, because it was, in that case, it would have been an elk that was taken in Yellowstone National Park on October the 15th of 2022. So that's one way that you can name the file that will allow you to very quickly get to what you're looking at. And that's the concept that we're looking at here with disk space and file access, as well as file names and directories. You can create these names and these directories, file and directory names as much as you want. But keep in mind that these are typically there is a limit on how long a file name could be, and also that the file systems like case sensitive names. So uppercase, lowercase kind of thing. Some do and some not. So typically your Linux systems will like case sensitive file and directory. So for example, on a Linux system, if I'm going to etc password to see what all my passwords are inside of Linux operating system, I actually need to type in capital or lowercase etc. If I tapped in capital etc, it's not going to find it. It's going to say the directory doesn't exist. Whereas if in Windows, if I did lowercase etc, or the folder name was etc, or the folder name, let's say, is uppercase A and lowercase LASKA for Alaska, if I typed it in my search function, if I typed in all lowercase, Windows is not case sensitive and it will find it. So that's an advantage that Windows has over other file systems like the extended file system within Linux. So keep that in mind as well. Some are case sensitive, but not all others are. Linux is, for example. So other attributes that can be put on the directories and the files, in particular the files, are called metadata. This is information that is behind the scenes. If you were to right click on a picture, for example, and you were to take a look at one of these pictures and look at properties, it's going to show you perhaps, depending on the camera that took the picture, it shows you geographic data of where it was taken, geo coordinates. It could show you what kind of shutter speed you're using. It shows you what kind of camera you're using. All that kind of stuff is in the metadata of the file. And it could be very useful for forensics or even other types of regular use type of functions. All right, security is another thing that we need to take a look at when we're managing these types of situations. Almost every one of these files, in fact, every one of the current file types or file system types and directory system types have some sort of security built in. Your Windows system have the ability to encrypt using BitLocker and other types of encryption tools, the directories as well as the individual files. So, and we could get, at some point we'll get into that more in depth, but one thing a lot of people have to realize is sometimes that encryption, when it's at the file level, is actually encrypting the file regardless of what its state is. In other words, is it in motion, is it being used, or is it just sitting there? But if you're only encrypting the directory, then that is only encrypted when the disk is shut down and or removed from the computer. If the disk is spinning, or if the SSD is functionally, the operating system is functional and operating, that folder is typically not encrypted unless you get in there and do something to override that and enforce that. So a lot of times, my customers will come to me and say, "Oh, I've got an encrypted file system." I said, "Okay, really? Do you? Let's talk about the details on that." Well, really, what that is, that's only typical scenario. It's only protecting them if the hard drive were removed from the computer. Then yes, it's encrypted. But if it's in the computer and the operating system's running, then the hacker will have access to it. So you have to work and do special types of encrypting. The other thing I mentioned we had talked about earlier is called journaling. And I would really want to kind of read a little bit of this from the book, because not a lot of people talk about journaling, even IT professionals. But journaling is essentially keeping a log file of what's happened to that particular file. So it says when a change is made to a file, the file system has two ways of managing it. One is to write change directly to the drive and be done with it. The second is journaling, where the file changes are also written to a special file called a journal. The journaling results in a more fault-resistant file system. If the file system crashes or the computer unexpectedly loses power, journaled file systems are more likely to survive without errors. So I mentioned it's kind of like a logging system. It is, but I wouldn't, as a security professional, I would not rely upon it as a log. Okay, it's really used for resilience. What it's doing is it's taking out some of the data from the file that you've been working on and information, setting it aside so that if something happens to the file, if the computer crashes, the computer can use the journal to recreate the file that has been damaged or destroyed. So it's offering some resistance into the faults in that type of area. So take a look at that in journaling. You don't really need to dig into it deeper on that one. But certainly make sure that you're aware of how that operates. So then, of course, the way that the SSDs or hard drives, they just lay down these files and they do it in a logical manner. But as you change, move, modify the files, they will rewrite those to the hard drive. And at some point, you need to go and do some cleanup to these the hard drive, because what you'll do is you'll get what we call fragmented hard drives or fragmented data. Fragmented data on hard drives is when the data has been moved around and it in doing so, it leaves blocks of open space, just small blocks of open space, and that results in your hard drive, again, whether it's an HDD or an SSD, results in the hard drive having kind of a mess in it. Really, is what it's like. It's like if you moved something around in a room and there was a carpet or like let's say you move a couch in a room, you move it from one space to the other, the dirt that had collected underneath that couch is going to need to be cleaned up, or you're going to see that couch was there at one point. It's going to be some residue left on the floor, right? So if we don't use disk cleanup tools, that will exist on the disk. The problem with that is that unlike the situation with your couch being moved, where you could literally just put something down on top of the dirt, you can move a nightstand, or you can move a table or another chair and place it right on top of the dirt without cleaning it up. With the files on the disks when you have that dirty space, if you will. You cannot typically lay down new files without doing some sort of cleanup. So if you were to look at exercise 4.6, there's some steps in here that will take you through the process of cleaning up the disk. And what it does when it does these types of things is it will scan your disk and find out where all the dirty sections are at. And then what it will do is it will literally pick up, you'll clean those off, pick up and move the folders and rearrange the folders and files on the disk. You won't even know it on yourself personally. It'll pick up and move those around so that the empty space is left over at the end of the disk instead of all around the disk. And what that does is that opens up space for you to save files to. And it's good to do from time to time. Back in the day, way old day, we had to do this more frequently because the disks were so small that we would fill up the disks very quickly. And so cleaning them up was I would say, sometimes I had a couple of computers I remember very distinctly on. I had scheduled the cleanup to occur on a weekly basis in order to make sure that it ran smoothly, because actually it does make your performance, at least it did. I don't know if it still does, but it makes your performance on your computer a little bit quicker, noticeably back in the day. I don't know if you would notice it much today because of SSDs. Anyway, there you go. That's how to take the broom out, clean up the disks, and how to organize yourself a little bit. If you're not an organized person, and maybe a little bit of organization in your life would help with some directories and files. All right, we'll talk later. Thank you for joining us on this episode.